Welcome to Evangelicalish, where we discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of the American evangelical church, deconstruction, faith, and God's love through it all. Remember, if you're listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any of your favorite podcast platforms, let us invite you to join the live interactive recording most Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on the Evangelicalish YouTube channel. Now to this episode of Evangelical-ish.
All right, everyone. Well, we're almost at that normal time, starting about an hour ahead of our usual feed, and we're glad you're here. I am Paul.
And I'm April.
How's the weather in Kentucky today? It was 104 effing degrees here today.
Ooh. It's like today was actually pretty cool because it's been rainy, so it was in the 70s.
Does it get humid there when it rains?
Yes, very much so.
Well, at least we don't have humidity. It truly is a dry heat out here. But yeah, they're predicting 108 tomorrow for us, which is crazy for June. And those of you who may be listening in Canada, 108 in Celsius is fucking hot. That's all. That's all I have to
wow.
say.
F word right out the bat.
Oh yeah, now we're explicit. Sorry about that. Well, you have something big to tell us today, and those on our Evangelicalish private page may know already, but
yeah, I announced it earlier in our Facebook group. I'm going to do a very brief announcement because my dog died a couple days ago, and I don't have the emotional bandwidth to give energy to this at this moment. But I will later. But I will be leaving Evangelical-ish at the end of the month. To be very evangelical about it, it's just the end of the season for me.
God has spoken, and it's starting to move to a new ministry.
Yeah. So, but I will still be on the next 3 episodes, and then some kind of fun news though. Jeremy's going to come back, our original co-host. So it'll be the 3 of us again, the last Wednesday of June, which I don't know exactly what that date is off the top of my head, but we're going to,
I think
the 26th.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So the last Wednesday of the month at 9 p.m. Eastern, back at the original time with the original group, just kind of one last hoorah before I depart and we hand over the keys to Paul.
Yeah. In fact, I just changed mics, so I may sound different. I just realized I was on my camera microphone. And my wife is going to join us for the summer, and she and I are going to do a show after this show. So I'll put that link in the chat in just a bit. But I just want to say, April, you leaving sucks. I'm not making you feel guilty, but sometimes we're like, and in the evangelicalish world, or in the evangelical world, it's like, oh, isn't this wonderful? I just want to say it's heartbreaking for me, but you are my friend before my podcast partner. And so the friend part is very happy and excited for you to pursue whatever you need to do to work in your life. But the other parts of me are like, shoot. So, yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'm sure I'll get very mushy at the end of the month. I'm going to disassociate and hold that down until then.
Very good. All right. We have a super great, our whole month is super great guest this month, by the way. Dan McClellan next week. And that's a morning show, so I have that. And then singer Candy Carpenter in 2 weeks. So 2 amazing shows coming up, and then a super big time guest tonight. So why don't you bring on our guest?
Yeah, so I feel like probably most of you know her, but we have Sarah McCammon on tonight. She is a national political correspondent for NPR, and she is the author of the Exvangelicals, which Paul's holding it up and I have it here. Loving, Living, and Leaving the White
Sarah, if you were holding yours up. Yeah.
All 3 of us right there. Yeah. So the Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. And I think most of us here, if you listen to the show, can relate in some way. So welcome, Sarah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very nice introduction. And I'm sorry about your dog. I have one. Yeah. I have one that is like right at the end of her life, and it's just so hard to make those decisions. I don't know, I kind of hope we don't have to, but with dogs, you usually do. So
I know. They hold on, man. I'm like, gosh, just go, just go.
It's so sad.
Did you guys have a theology in your evangelical days that your dog would be in heaven, or would the dog not be in heaven?
I remember it's funny you say this because I remember this conversation, and it was like, well, there will be animals in heaven because the lion is going to lay down with the lamb. That's what I was told. But we don't know.
Children will play with snakes. Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't know what will happen to our animals. Like, we don't know if they go to heaven or not. We don't. I think my mom told me that she didn't think the animals had souls, so probably not. Too bad, but maybe they do. Who knows?
Yeah, I heard mixed reviews too. I don't think there was ever a straight consensus. Like, there were the people that were like, no, they don't have a soul. But then there were people that genuinely did believe that their dogs or their pets would go to heaven. But, people that didn't say the sinner's prayer would go to hell. And that always seemed kind of like, that God would allow the pets, but not the people.
The pets get in, not the people. Yeah.
Yeah. My favorite though is in the like I'm in a couple rapture groups just to keep eyes on, the end times stuff. And there's been lots of talk on they believe that the rapture is going to happen, with it. Christians will get sucked up into the sky and go to heaven before, like, without having to die. And they're like, well, what happens to our pets when the rapture happens? So I know people, bless their hearts, that literally have like letters written out already, like in case of rapture, where they have like 2 weeks of food like already stored so that the dog will have somewhere to go. And there's even there's like an after the rapture pet care that a couple like it's legit.
Pagan pet company. Yeah.
Yeah. That like atheists will take care of your pets and they don't charge. I think it's just to make people think better because the atheists obviously don't believe in the rapture, but
yeah, that's fast. I think I have actually heard of that. When you first said it, I thought it was like, oh, that sounds like a brilliant grift, but it's not even. It's just like what is it? Is it about like starting a conversation or?
So
there could be a whole business line here. Like, no, we'll take care of your garden after the rapture. We'll take care of you. Yeah.
I do think there's probably some spoof sites, but the one that I read that claims to be real was started by two Christians who kind of joined forces with an atheist friend of theirs. And like, they agree, it says in there too, like the atheists basically agree, like they won't be Christian before the rapture. And that you can sign up if you're an atheist to be a volunteer to take care of someone's pets. And then the Christians can sign up too. And so then once the rapture happens, it's just kind of a matchmaking situation. Which I'm like, in the chaos, if the rapture were to actually happen, planes would be crashing. There'd be countless car crashes. I mean, there's levels of just chaos that are going to be happening. I highly doubt people are going to have time to go and find their pet that they were matched with. But.
Yeah, maybe not.
Well, I grew up with one of those. My dad was like, no, pets don't have souls. They will not be in heaven. It's like, thanks, Dad, for being so sweet. My spouse, her dad was brilliant. And he told her, if you need the dog to be in heaven for you to be happy, God's going to have the dog for you in heaven.
That's a good answer.
That's a really good answer. Yeah.
So, Sarah, tell us kind of what was your inspiration to writing the Exvangelicals?
So I had my own kind of like departure from evangelicalism, which I chronicle in the book, along with a lot of other people's stories. Probably like a lot of people, it was not one moment, it was gradually over time, for a lot of different reasons. And that happened, roughly by my early 20s. So that's 20 years ago, as much as I hate to say that, but it is. And so, fast forward to my early mid 30s in 2015, I was, kind of unexpectedly really assigned to cover the Republican primary and then the Trump campaign. And like so many other reporters, I wound up writing lots of stories about evangelicals, and how they vote and how they make decisions. And, everybody was obsessed with the evangelical vote. And I had this space from it, but it was really weird to be covering events and covering issues where all of these themes and some of the same characters that were a big deal in my childhood were emerging. And so I was thinking a lot about my evangelical background, and I was just kind of, as an ex-evangelical, fascinated by these discussions, because I think everybody was, but I had this particular really deep tie. And I grew up in a family that was very engaged in politics. Like, we didn't really follow sports, we followed politics. And my parents were very motivated by their religious beliefs to be active in Republican and conservative politics. So, I had kind of become a journalist in a lot of ways, I think, because I wanted to just sort of ask questions and see where they led. And I felt, I wouldn't have articulated it this way then, but I felt kind of uncomfortable with the sort of activist edge of a lot of what I was seeing. So journalism felt much safer, and much more kind of like neutral territory, which I needed. So I find myself, kind of not really, not choosing a team, but thinking a lot about the team I had grown up to sort of be, being raised to be on. And I spent a few years kind of thinking about that juxtaposition. I was, in the course of my reporting, I ran across the Exvangelical hashtag, which of course Blake Chastain coined in 2015, 16, I think, and other people picked up. And then, a lot of people started having, there just seemed like there was this escalation of these conversations, around what it meant to be evangelical and the kind of related idea of deconstruction. And so I started paying attention to those conversations and thinking about them more. And basically when January 6th happened, I decided I wanted to kind of do something that was synthesizing all of that, because for years I would get so many questions about it from, when I'd give public speeches or just from friends. Like, the first thing people wanted to know when they knew that I was a political journalist and had grown up evangelical was like, how do you explain all of this?
Yeah.
But of course, evangelicalism and deconstruction is about a lot more than politics. I just think that this political moment has catalyzed a lot of conversations, that about things people were probably, I think, like me, thinking about for a long time.
Yeah, it was, for our household, it was the last straw. There were a whole bunch of things we were thinking through in all of this that didn't make sense. And then, and we had become increasingly, and my wife was an elected official at the time, but we had become increasingly concerned about the politics. And really it was then Trump was okay, we're done. This is it. And so as you've been talking to people, is the politics sort of that last straw for a lot of the evangelicals who have left and deconstructed that you've talked to?
Yeah, I mean, not everybody. And as I say in the book, it wasn't for me. I was really out of that about a decade before any of that. But I definitely ran across and talked to a lot of people who said it was, or if not Trump, like kind of the political environment that arose around 2020, the way that some churches responded to Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd, or responded to the COVID pandemic. Yeah, that's when I heard a lot. And it's been interesting since the book has come out. I get so many emails and, messages on social media, DMs and so forth, from people who've read it and grew up in this world and say essentially like, this is also my story. So, and a lot of them, and quite a number of them have said that 2016 was kind of a turning point. So I don't think it is for everyone, but I think it's certainly been, like I said, a catalyst for more discussion. I think with so much public attention to evangelicalism and what it means to be evangelical, at a time when it's so much easier for people to kind of have these sort of niche conversations, they're all there's infinite spaces to go find people like-minded people and have a discussion that, might not have been on the mainstream news 20 years ago or something, or certainly would not have been had in a church. But I think, that's kind of it's impossible to separate this movement such as it is from the political moment we find ourselves in.
What I appreciate too about your book is there are a lot of books out there about, quote unquote deconstruction from evangelicals who are still in it, who I don't think actually talk to any evangelicals. And in your book, you share some of your story, but you also just interview a lot of people and get their perspective. So it definitely feels like, oh, this is a book about me. Like I can read myself in this story, which makes you feel less alone. So I very much appreciate that. I wanted to ask from your journalistic, analytical perspective, what was it about Trump that drew evangelicals in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was and still is like this sense, and I think I try to explain it to people outside the evangelical world, but if you've grown up in it, you've almost certainly heard from somebody this idea that, America used to be this godly country and our culture used to be Christian, and we have fallen away, and all the problems in our society are a result of that, and we need to bring Christianity back. And it is true that the country is less Christian and more secular than it once was. That is a demographic reality. And I think many evangelicals interpret that as some sort of attack or a loss, at minimum, a loss of power, which it also is. And at the same time that the sort of, demographic, I guess, dominance, the numbers dominance of white Christianity has been declining. We've also seen this ascendance of the Christian right. Robbie Jones at the Public Religion Research Institute wrote a piece, I think, for his Substack that I always point people to because he described it very well, and he has all the graphs because he's a numbers guy. But basically, yeah, we've seen this as we see this erosion of white Christian dominance in the way that it once was. We've also seen sort of a reaction from the white Christian right. And I don't want to over reduce it racially. Obviously, there are many, according to polls, a growing number of people of color who support Trump, for example, but still the overwhelming majority of Trump supporters are white. And if you look at the way that, white Christians vote compared to Christians of color, especially Black Christians, it's very, very different. So this is why I sort of try to untangle the racial aspect without, with the understanding that everybody is an individual, and people can't just be reduced to their race, of course, but there are trends within groups, and they shape the way people vote and think about these issues. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
I think the political piece of it is, it's complicated, but it's tied to, I see it as tied to a loss or a perceived loss of cultural dominance among evangelical Christians.
And you kind of hit on a question I was going to bring, is that your subtitle of the book is Living and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. I guess define white evangelical, and why did you specifically put that in sort of the subtitle of your book?
Well, again, when you look at voting data, white evangelicals overwhelmingly support Trump and Republicans, and actually that trend has just been deepening and increasing in recent years, according to like the Pew Center. Whereas you might have, if you think about just basic theological commitments, Christians of color who might hold very similar theology to white Christians are, as a group, again, going to vote very, very differently. When it comes to evangelical, I think everybody here is probably well aware that, evangelical is sort of a contested term and people define it differently. And some people talk about fundamentalism versus evangelicalism. In my experience growing up, the line between fundamentalist and evangelical was almost non-existent. I went to a church or a Christian school that was run by a church that I would say was more towards the fundamentalist end of the spectrum. Girls had to wear dresses every day. There was, we could wear makeup. There was another Christian school where people couldn't, so we weren't the most fundamentalist, but it was all Bob Jones and Abeka textbooks. Oof. My church was, like a charismatic evangelical church. So, we really emphasized spiritual gifts and speaking in tongues. And then my college was an evangelical free college, which was kind of another thing altogether. But, in my experience, we had regardless of sort of what subsect of evangelicalism you came from, there was a unifying sort of essential theology, which really focused on, personal conversion and the need to convert others, a personal relationship with Jesus, a literal view of the Bible, and and often a skepticism of other Christian movements, right? So skepticism of Catholicism, skepticism of mainline Protestantism very often. And so, when I talk about evangelicalism, I'm generally talking about conservative Protestants. But, people have defined it differently than that. And some people argue about, like, are charismatics really evangelicals? And I mean, yes. We were.
Yes.
And if you look at, certainly if you look at the evangelicals Trump surrounds himself with, they come from all of those different traditions.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting too, just growing up. Like, I grew up also charismatic, Pentecostal, and
Assemblies of God, baby.
Yeah, and
yeah.
we would look at Baptist or Church of Christ or like these other denominations, and they were not necessarily, I don't know that I would have said they weren't Christian, but I was doubtful. I feel like evangelicals are the ones that came up with the Christian in quotes, where they're quote unquote Christian. They're not real Christians. And it was wild to me to learn how many Christian denominations actually currently exist worldwide, not even historically. It's like over 46,000. And that makes you feel a certain way as an evangelical.
Yeah, I talk in the book about how I thought that nominal Christian just meant mainline Protestant. Like, I thought those were the same thing growing up, because that's how they were talked about,
Yeah, or God forbid Catholic.
Yeah. I mean, we were iffy if Baptists were Christians, but we knew for a fact the Episcopalians were not. They would not be in heaven. So it's crazy. And we were certain that we weren't fundamentalist, but I look back, like, we weren't allowed to go to movies when I was a kid. We weren't allowed to have long hair. We couldn't dance, but we weren't fundamentalist. You almost, and I think this is your experience, Sarah, and I'd like to hear it. You grow up in this world that you think is a normal world, and maybe some of what leads people to be evangelicals is you realize, oh wait, our world is not so normal. Was that some of your experience?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, like a lot of what you talk about, I mean, long hair on boys was not allowed in my Christian school. It was heavily discouraged, I think, among most people that I grew up around. And, with movies, like, I talk about how we weren't totally banned from going to movie theaters. I knew some people who were, but we were not, but they were very carefully curated. There were lots of rules. I mean, which as a parent, I understand that, giving your kids some guidance is not a bad thing, but the guidance would seem to be, pretty strict in my household, and it was for religious reasons, right? But yeah, I think that the way in application, often like fundamentalists are just people who are like us, but just a little stricter. Like, those are the fundamentalists. We're not the fundamentalists, And then, I mean, my church also had a Bill Gothard IBLP phase that it kind of entered around the time I was entering kind of middle school. And several families started kind of moving into that sphere. And I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Bill Gothard, but this is, of course, the organization that was profiled in the Shiny Happy People documentary on Amazon, and which the Duggar family from 18 Kids and Counting, or 19 Kids and Counting?
19, I think it ended at 19. Yeah.
It ended at 19, right? Yeah, that they followed. So, that organization, I think, by any reasonable measure, was fundamentalist, and some people would even say a cult, but we didn't see ourselves as fundamentalists either. I don't know who. I guess some people have described themselves as fundamentalists, but I don't think it became evangelical. Became like the word that had the friendlier, kind of more modern gloss.
I guess because you could always find someone that was more fundy than you were. So it was easier to be like, well, I'm not that bad.
Right.
I just watched go back to April's question on Trump, perhaps. I just watched the Dance for the Devil documentary, which is, I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's about TikTok dancers who are in what some are calling a cult of Shekinah Church and 7M management. Which I think
is the 7M like for Seven Mountains?
I think it's for Seven Mountain, yeah. But they have church services that you can only attend if you're invited. Like, the public is not allowed to come into these church services, and all of these crazy things. So it does seem like we were all, if I can use the term every right winger use, groomed for authoritarian leaders. Is that what we're seeing in this? Is that Christians, to get ourselves back in charge, we are leaning towards authoritarian leaders, and because that's how we were raised up, with that type of authority?
I mean, a lot of people have made that argument, and it's just, I mean, part of the reason I wrote the book is I was seeing, and I'm seeing even more conversations around the kind of evangelical subculture that existed when, all of us were younger, which in many ways, I think very explicitly was, I mean, to be fair, raising children to be a way that I think our parents believed was best. It wasn't, it was out of good intentions, but it was also very useful for people in charge, I guess.
Yeah. Do you see any trends, like from your research with Exvangelicals? Do you think, is this kind of just a movement of the time? Like, do you think there will be another kind of big exodus later on, or what are the trends saying?
Well, the data that I look at this data all the time, and it's like some of it's pretty new and some of it's kind of emerging, but like Public Religion Research Institute and the Pew Center and even American Enterprise Institute have looked at some of this, particularly the trend called the nuns, religious nuns, like NONES, and then like disaffiliation from religion, which is a similar idea. But I mean, big picture, it's not just evangelicalism. And I always want to be careful to say that. Like, I wrote about Exvangelicals because that's sort of, I think it's a specific experience. There is this shared subculture, and there's a certain degree of insularity for many people who grew up evangelical. So there's this kind of, again, shared kind of consciousness that you have if you grow up in this world. And then if you leave it, there's a certain specific kind of pain and challenge and, making sense of certain things. But it's not just evangelicalism. Like, religious affiliation is declining almost across the board in this country, and has been for a while, but it's really become more and more pronounced. And, there are different theories about why. And some people think it's because of just this perception that Christianity in particular is so closely aligned with, in many people's minds, with a political project. I think it's probably bigger than that. I think that's probably part of it, but I think it's probably bigger than that. If you look at Europe, Europe has been on a path towards secularization for a much longer time than the US. We're obviously a younger country. Europe's not a country, but you know what I'm saying?
Right,
like,
right.
The US is newer than Europe in its current iteration anyway. There were people here before, white Europeans, but there's just a lot more, European history with Christianity than there is here. So it's hard to compare, but I think it is worth noting that secularization that we're seeing here has been seen in Europe as well, and much earlier. So, like, where it goes, I don't exactly know. I guess, you could predict that it'll just continue, that the country will be more and more and more secular. I wonder, though, if there's a certain point where that tapers off. And I think if we look at the world and we look at human history, like, people have always kind of sought spirituality, religion, they need something. And I think that's kind of probably where religion comes from, by and large. And this is getting kind of outside of my expertise. Yeah. Like, I cannot predict the future, and I am not a sociologist or even a historian of religion, but I do wonder, like, does it continue, or how long does it continue? And is there a point where people kind of, is there a generation that will bounce back and go, no, we want religion, or just maybe different, religion than what we have.
And it's such a point of community in American society. We have so few other, I had some British friends, and they're like, God, you guys don't walk to the park like we do in Britain. And we don't have as many connection points, it seems. And so it could bounce back from that. But
no, I mean, our whole country was built, so much of our country was built around the car. Yeah. Whereas Europe had a chance to be, developed before cars were ubiquitous. And so I think about this all the time. Like, I live in more than 100-year-old house and neighborhood. And so my whole neighborhood is walkable and everything is on like a human scale because it was built before there were cars. But so much of this country was developed after that. And so, yes, I mean, you take away, we don't have any of those natural built-in third places in the same way that I think like Europe does. And so churches provide that. Like, it's an intentional place where people go and see each other, and not just churches. I mean, any religious organization can do that, but Christianity is still the biggest religion by far in the US. So, I mean, I think you make a really good point, and I really kind of wonder about, I mean, there are plenty of other places you can find community, but it's not as easy, I think, as a lot of people would like.
Yeah. Making friends as adults is not easy already. And I think that is one draw that the church has, is it's a built-in community. Although a lot of them would also expect some sort of conformity, although they wouldn't say that out loud. In your interviews and writing this book, was there anything that surprised you that you weren't expecting to learn?
I mean, I think, like, I've been asked this question before, and I feel like I should have a better answer to it. I feel like you'd be like, oh, I was surprised by so many things. But I mean, part of what drew me to write the book was the fact that as I started paying attention to like Exvangelical and deconstruction, Facebook groups and people on Twitter who were using these hashtags, and certainly TikTok and all of that. So many of the themes were so common, like the same, such familiar themes, and many of them were things that I had also thought about. I talk in the book a lot about my grandfather, who came out as gay when I was very young, and the tension that created in my family, just because of my parents' beliefs, and also to some degree the political climate that was emerging at that time, 80s and 90s, around gay rights. So.
You were worried Grandpa was going to hell.
I was, very worried. I mean, I talk about praying for him almost every night at dinner time, but these kinds of things, like concerns about non-Christians, questions about how the church talks about sexuality, like these kinds of themes are themes that I was seeing everywhere. And so, I'd go talk to people, and I'd love to say I was surprised. It was more like, oh, I guess the biggest surprise was like, oh, here's yet another new specific application of this challenge. Like, there's a woman I interviewed who talked about her fear of the rapture, which a lot of us can relate to, and told this story about like basically her mother faking the rapture to like test her faith. And I mean, some of the stories people told me, like, having grown up in that world, it's like, yes, I'm not shocked, but still kind of, frankly, just surprised. I guess the surprise would be in just the degree to which people struggle with these things so almost universally within this community. But the feeling is the same, but the particulars are all a little bit different.
Oh my gosh. I've thought about this a lot, that I don't know that, like, my parents are boomers age, and they didn't grow up with the same rapture anxiety that I grew up with. Like, they had A Thief in the Night, but they were older by the time that came out. So it wasn't like a childhood thing they grew up with. But when I was 10, I think is when the Left Behind the Kids version came out, and then just a slew of Left Behind movies. And as someone who genuinely thought that I was left behind for about 20 minutes when I was 13, that it's terrifying. That's not a fun joke to test someone's faith. Like, you just look back in hindsight, and especially now that I'm, meeting more people that may not have grown up religious at all, and I tell some stories so nonchalantly, like, because it was just my life, and they are horrified. And then it just kind of makes me realize, that's not normal. That was not okay.
I think that is one of the most healing things, is to have people that love you, that have a totally different experience and background, and that you can kind of get that reality check from. Like, for me, it's my husband, who grew up Reformed Jewish. And it's just some of the things I tell him, he's like, no, that's not at all how I grew up. Like what, and it's like validating in a way, to be reminded, like, I'll ask him, like, you don't ever worry that you're going to hell? And he's like, no, why would I worry about that? Just because it wasn't a focus of his religious tradition. And, it's just thought about very differently than the way that evangelicals talked about it. But all kinds of other things too. It's like, when it's all growing up, it gets really baked in, but it's good to be reminded that there are lots of other ways that people grow up.
And one of the traumatic things, as a child wanting to fit in with your peers, we weren't allowed to go to movies. I'm a little bit older than you guys. And so Star Wars came out when I was in elementary school. Everybody saw Star Wars. And another, the Bad News Bears. And so all of my friends, so I would always have to like buy books and read the book and try to, act like I had seen the movie. And as you know, books sometimes are different than movies, and it ran to some embarrassing things. But I heard you on another podcast. What's that?
That's so much effort too, to like go read the book and try to figure out what was what. That just sounds like a lot.
It is, and it was traumatic. But I heard you on another podcast with a friend. We talk about cussing, that when you moved out of your religious space, you adopted, and I dropped an F-bomb earlier in the show here, but you adopted cussing in your life maybe for a while because you could, and it felt good.
Yeah. And then I think the older I get, the more I'm like, I move the other direction. Like, I don't need to do that all the time. Don't want to make it sound like I swore like a sailor, but it was like weirdly liberating to realize that I could swear and, no one would be upset and it was fine. But now I have kids, and they've heard the dirty words, of course, but they know they're, like a lot of things, we talk about how there's a time and a place, Yeah. And if I hear too many, I'm like, no, find other words, but it's not like if you drop a swear word, it's the night is over and we're all going to have a terrible time, because that's unnecessary too.
Right. Everything in moderation. Like, I think too, as a parent as well, I see very valid reasons to teach my children. Granted, they're younger now, but once they're older, because I've thought about this, because those mom anxiety thoughts always come in. But to tell themselves, like, hey, wait to have sex until, like, and like there's a way to have good sex, there's a way to have bad sex. And it does bring a lot of issues and problems in your life, but you don't have to bring in soul ties and damaged goods and all of the shame that was put on me. And I'm sure you too, Sarah and Paul, like that, that especially like for a girl, like your worth was almost in whether or not you were a virgin when you got married. And that, like, there's nothing wrong with waiting, but waiting because you're ashamed or because you've been shamed into it, that's also not healthy and can cause so many other problems once you get married. Ask me how I know. Don't really. But yeah.
Yeah. No, and there's a chapter on that, and I talk some about my own experience, and I'm on my second marriage, so leave it at that, right? But and then the experiences of lots of other people. And I agree. I have teenagers, and the conversations that I have with them about that are very much like what you described. Like, I think sometimes there's this idea, and I've heard it certainly in sort of reaction to some of the critiques of evangelicalism and purity culture. I've seen evangelicals respond, essentially with the idea that, like, well, what do you want? Do you want girls to be treated like objects? Do you think hookup culture is good? And no, like, I don't think that's good either. But I don't think we just have like a binary choice here between, you either have no sexual knowledge or experience until you're married, and you're, maybe if you follow like the teachings of some of these people like Bill Gothard, you don't even really date, you just court. And if you don't follow that, you're like a dirty tissue, to use the purity culture analogy, or, sex doesn't matter. It's meaningless. It's empty. Like it doesn't have to be one or the other. Like,
Right.
and I think, I try to talk to my kids about just, responsibility and health and consent, and just, in a way, you could apply the golden rule to sex, I think.
Yeah.
Treat people well, right?
Yeah. Consent is so huge. It was something I was never taught. I was just taught bad, 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 bad until marriage. And then once you're married, you please your husband. So I was never taught consent on either situation. And I think, today the Senate blocked the right to contraception bill, or Republican senators, I should say, which was supposed to, protect access for women to birth control. And I think that's a good example of that black and white. Like, no, there's some in between here in a political scale, which, Christian nationalism, I think, is a whole other topic, and why a lot of people deconstructed, like, as you had mentioned earlier. But yeah, that black and white thinking is really hard to let go of. And I almost wonder if that's kind of maybe some of the draw too on the more conservative GOP side too, because a lot of those, there's not a lot of room for nuance in some of their policy positions. And when you already are taught not to have nuance and that everything is black and white, it's an easy jump into that.
I mean, I think any group can fall into groupthink and dogmatism. I don't think it's limited to any political persuasion. But I think that, and I think it's a human tendency. There's a tendency to sort of want to find your group and then trust them and think like them. And I think finding, it's a complicated world. And gosh, I mean, I cover politics. I talk to people with all kinds of different ideas, and people feel really, really strongly about things that their neighbors or friends or family members feel really, really strongly about in the opposite direction. And it's really painful and difficult. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to sort of lock in to a perspective and say, these are the good guys and this is what they think. And so I am going to agree with them on everything. I found my team. I want to be comfortable. And I think all humans are susceptible to that, because nuance and complexity can be really scary and unsettling. And, I think this is one of the things that draws people to fundamentalist religion of all kinds, is the idea that, you can have the answers. Just here are the answers. Here's the way to live. Here's a plan. Here's a program. But then people who deviate from it become a threat or feel like a threat.
Mm. And do you have a message in that space? I saw like Kristen Dumais did she endorsed your book, and her book, Jesus and John Wayne, is about how this has been building in evangelicalism for a while. And Catherine Stewart's Power Worshippers, which was kind of the basis of the God and Country documentary. I mean, I know you're a reporter more looking at these, but is there, let me add, when I was growing up, we were told it's all grace, nothing but grace. And here are the rules that you have to follow. And we're now in a season where, to make our country great again, for a lot of my, I guess now former friends, is we have to put Christian law onto the country, and then God will make our country great again. And Christian law is arguable. But in the line of those books, where do you feel like you fit in with your message of, hey, this can be a little bit of an issue for our country if Christians start trying to put their Christian beliefs into law?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I wanted to do with the book is, and I certainly cite both of those books in mind, because I think they both were really important in laying some of the groundwork and explaining a lot of the history. I wanted to, partly because I was seeing so many evangelical voices sharing their perspectives, I really wanted to kind of give voice to that experience from the inside, in more of a kind of personal, textured, more visceral kind of way. I think I've had several people reach out and say, in addition to lots of people who grew up evangelical who feel really seen by the book, they tell me, and really described. I've also heard from quite a number of people with no evangelical experience who have said something to the effect of, I just could not make sense of how Christians could get behind some of these things. And after reading the book, I think I get it more. I understand the thinking and the culture a little bit more. So,
and are they expressing empathy when they come with that opinion?
Some are. I mean, I think some of it's just like, oh, okay, I get it now. And I wanted that. Like I wanted people to, I believe that telling stories and sharing stories is really important for having, what we're doing and what we're trying to do in this country is really kind of incredible and not super precedented, bringing together so many different cultures and religions and having this commitment to freedom and to, the idea of being an American is supposed to be that as flawed as we have been in our history many, many times. But, I like what Barack Obama said about this, that basically we haven't always lived up to our ideals, but the ideals are good. And I fundamentally kind of feel that way still, that, pluralism and secular democracy and freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom of thought is all really important. And it's hard to do, though. Like, it's hard to bring really disparate people together and create one country. And I think it's a worthy goal because, I think, I don't think that having the state tell people what to believe is a great thing or who to be, And so, but it's hard to get there. I mean, in practicality, it's really difficult to get there. And so I think having the more that we can talk about it and try to understand different perspectives and experiences, I hope and believe, maybe naively, that will help us in the long run. We're in a really difficult moment, though, right now, I think, obviously.
Yeah, the polarization is definitely very extreme right now. But I do think there is, it's hard to hate someone if you have dinner with them, and you see them interacting with their kids and see how much they love their family and, just humanizing someone on the other side of maybe the political aisle or even a religious aisle. There's definitely needs more for that. And I think that is an important piece too, especially when you're deconstructing. Like, I definitely went through an angry stage where I was like, burn it all down.
For sure.
But the pendulum swings and then you kind of.
Oh, is that a phase? I'm still sitting there. Sorry. I guess I haven't come through that phase yet.
Yeah.
It's okay. It doesn't have to be a phase, but it's ebbed and flowed for me for sure.
Yeah. And I think, there's nothing wrong with, you can only be where you are, but it is important to remember that I think most people, and maybe not the people at the very top who are calling the shots and being manipulative and all the things, but I do think your average evangelical and just your average person in general, regardless of their beliefs, has really good intentions and wants to do good. You only know what you know. And I believe the church and the people that raised me thought that they were doing what was best by telling me about the rapture and telling me about hell and telling me about all of these things, because they also genuinely believed it. And in some ways I've kind of to the point now where I'm like, obviously intention does not negate harm. So that it doesn't mean it's not harmful, but I think we will get a lot further if we can have that conversation. I can look at someone and be like, hey, I know that you mean well. And because I know I meant well when I said these same things and when I did these things and try to find that common ground of like, hey, can we mean well and stop harming people that are not like us or in a marginalized group that we think is, quote unquote, an abomination.
Where are you on that spectrum, Sarah,
I think,
coming out of evangelicalism?
On what spectrum?
Like, have you gone through an angry phase, and are you? There's like a grieving process, perhaps, and have you had a healing from it, maybe at this point, a little bit?
Yeah, I think. Well, I'm glad I wrote this book. I guess I was 40 when I started writing it, and I'm a couple years older now, 3 to be exact. And I am glad I didn't write it at 25. I think it would have been angrier. And I also hadn't had as much time to kind of marinate in my thinking about a lot of these things. So I definitely have had anger since then and recently about some aspects of the things I was raised with and the impact of them. But I think, one of the things actually that writing the book helped me do is I tried to be really honest and unflinching in talking about some of the harms of things like purity culture, or like, James Dobson and his ilk's views about discipline and parenting, or, the way that LGBTQ people were often treated in churches. Like, I tried to be very direct and honest about what that was, but also as I was writing, I just kind of naturally was reflecting on, well, what was the intent and what were some of the good things? Because there's a reason people are drawn to these movements, and there's a reason people stay in them. And I think, I came also as a parent, I think I have a little more grace now for my own parents than I would have before I started my own parenting journey, because I do recognize how, we're just doing our best, and we love those little people, and we want them to be safe and protected. And, if the people that you trust are telling you this is how your little ones are going to be safe and protected, most people are going to do that, whatever that is. So, yeah.
Well, it's a vicious cycle too. I saw a short film years ago. I might have been at Sundance. I don't remember, but I remember it was called Dig. And basically the premise is it's this man who just goes out all day, every day, and just digs a hole. And the hole gets huge, and he ends up getting arrested because he's digging a hole and he's not supposed to dig a hole. But then it cuts to his little daughter, who's probably like 8 or 9, and she just starts digging the hole. And she doesn't know why she's digging the hole, but she's just digging the hole because her dad was digging the hole. And like, it was just like this perfect illustration of just like the human condition. And sometimes we do things, we don't really consciously know why we're doing it. We're just doing it because it's all we've ever seen. And I think that comes into play, not just with evangelicalism, but with any type of belief system, or just however we're raised.
Well, this is the thing about institutions, like whether they're religious institutions or, social institutions, things like churches, right? They're created for a reason. And most of them there are some institutions that are horrible and should be abolished, like slavery is a paradigmatic example of that. But something like, marriage, right, is an institution that when it was first created was pretty terrible for women. But like, I like being married. I think marriage is great. And, and not everybody does, and that's fine. But like, I think one of the challenges is when we sort of critique and deconstruct and maybe reconstruct some of the institutions as we sort of evolve as people and figure out like, well, that was harmful. That didn't work so well. So how do we improve and change and evolve? Well, there's an impulse sometimes to tear things down. And again, some things need to be torn down. But then that does leave the question of like, what's left in its place, and what do you rebuild, and how do you have a life and a community and like a structure for how to live, which kind of brings us back to what we were talking about earlier of just sort of the function of church and religion. And I don't claim to have the answers, but I also try to be, when I talk about this, I want to be very straightforward, about the fact that those are things that many people feel they need, and that church has often provided,
Yeah, and I know that you have.
And that's not true.
Right. I know you have a hard stop in a few minutes, but I do want to ask, since you were so pragmatic and honest and, or just factual in your storytelling in your book, you made deconstruction. You told it honestly. It's not that, we get demonized a lot that people only deconstruct because they want to have sex. That it's just all about sex. And you write this book where maybe that's part of it, but it's just an honest journey. And I could imagine that the people that are constantly demonizing, this quote unquote Exvangelical movement, the people who are still evangelicals, have you received any hate for writing this book?
I have been amazed how little I've received.
Wow.
Yeah. I've gotten a couple of letters concerned about my soul. One was handwritten and sent to my but mostly it's been really, really positive feedback. And even fairly conservative Christian publications have been, they disagree with me, right? But they're evangelical and they think that's the way to be. That's fine. But they've been pretty kind. And I was a little surprised. I expected more blowback because, I know, for example, Kristen Cobes-Dumay and Beth Alzenbar and other, particularly women who have written books that could be seen as critical. Even Kristen's book, which is very academic, it's not a screed by any stretch of the means, very thoroughly researched. They've gotten a lot of blowback. And so I don't know if maybe people who, because I'm like in the mainstream media, that I'm already sort of written off as,
Yeah.
I don't know. Or, I like to think maybe it was because I was so honest and personal in the book, and that was hard to do, but I felt like if I was going to write a book that was part memoir, I needed to be really transparent about what it was that, why it was that I was no longer evangelical, because of that idea that like, it's just because you want to be cool or because you want to have sex or whatever the case may be. And I wanted to really explain, like, no, it was not, I did not leave evangelicalism because of those things. Obviously, when you leave a very strict religious community, your behavior might change afterward. But I don't think that was the driving force. And some of these things were issues that, were questions for me or problems for me from a very, very young age. And so I don't know if that approach, if it's like harder to argue, going back to this idea of stories, if it's harder to argue with someone's personal story, maybe.
Yeah, that's very true. That's it. And that's what we were taught in evangelicalism. Your story can't be argued against. I do want you to tell us where the book is available and all of that, but I do have to ask, half jokingly, at NPR, like, how is the process when you and Rachel Maddow and Jon Stewart get your talking points for, liberal causes each day, so that you can spout their rhetoric for the world? When does that happen?
It's like a satanic ritual, right? Just kidding.
There are no talking points, at least not for me. And I'm a journalist. Like, I love a story that counters somebody's narrative or preconceived ideas. And I don't care whose they are, liberal, conservative, I don't care. Like, I do not see myself as carrying water for any point of view or party, certainly. There's no interest in that. And that's why I became a journalist, because I didn't want to do that. I know how sometimes the media is perceived. I just try to do my work as authentically as I can, and not worry too much about the rest, I guess.
Beautiful. Well, tell people where they can find you and find the book.
I'm on Substack and Instagram, Sarah McCammon Journalist, and then my Substack is it's called Off the Air, a journalist's after hours thoughts, and it's some religion and politics, and it's some just whatever I'm thinking about. It's free. And then the book, The Exvangelicals, is available all the usual places. It's whoops, I almost knocked over my drink.
Oh, well, I'll hold it up again.
The Exvangelicals. Google will lead
EX.
you to it. Yes, Exvangelicals. I always say it's great if you can get it from a local bookstore. It's available all the places. And there's an audiobook, which I narrated. So I know some people like that. And it's funny, sometimes I've noticed at like events, people come up and be like, I listened to the audiobook, so I didn't really read it. And I'm like, I don't care. Don't apologize. I'm just glad you enjoyed the book. And that totally counts. So,
that totally counts as reading. You're still getting the content.
Absolutely. I use audiobooks all the time because I'm busy.
Well, thanks for being with us, and we're at your stop time.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It was a good conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
Thanks,
and
Sarah.
everyone, join us next week. We'll be back with Dan McClellan, and look for the times on social media.
And I put a link. Ashley and I are going to talk in a bit if anybody wants to join us. So yeah, take care.
All right. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Oh, I better hit the in the stream. Yeah. All right. Thanks, April. And if anybody missed, April is stepping away at the end of the month. And I'm sure we'll be talking more about that. And also just remind everybody, the last show of the month, we're going to go back in the regular time segment, and Jeremy's going to join us, and we'll wrap it all up then.
Yes.
Yeah, it'll be beautiful. All right. Good night, everyone. We'll see you soon.